Describe social impact bonds, they're not bonds, right? Actually, from our perspective, private debt. So we make a loan to finance the provision of typically preventive human services. And the repayment of that loan is through the proceeds of what's being called a pay-for-success contract. I've been engaging in a lot of the conversations around how do you take this approach and apply it to the developing world. Player in the transaction is government, and from our is the one identifying the policy priority, as well as putting in place what are the payments that they are willing to pay for the social outcomes. And perspective, we're really agnostic on the issue area because that's really the job of government, to identify what are their particular policy priorities. Key role in a social impact bond, or a social impact not a bond as it were, is a service provider. You need you need an organization that has a proven model that can address that issue area. We don't piece of it, of one of these public-private partnerships, are the investors. And is, in some sense, very important. What we've found in the transactions that we've been doing is that there's always a critical component of either philanthropic investors that are coming in on a very concessionary basis, taking a first loss position that enables the transaction to leverage more private capital, or philanthropy that is coming in with essentially a recoverable grant. But typically there's been a blended finance structure. We announced last summer that we were financing an expansion of an early childhood education program. In Salt Lake, there is an incredible early education program that really takes high-risk kids and has been measuring results for about 6 years, tracking them through elementary school. And what they've seen is if they can get kids into their preschool program, they do a pre-test with those kids to figure out which one of them are really at risk for failure once they reach kindergarten. And they track those kids who fail that pre-test through elementary school. And what they found is that nearly 100% of them stay on track and on grade level and aren't using remedial services. They have a waiting list to get into the preschool program, no more funding availability to actually fund the program. Goldman Sachs provided a loan through the United Way of Salt Lake, which is a wonderful nonprofit on the ground that really serves as a convener of local service providers. They use those funds to pay for the teachers in the classrooms, the supplies, everything that's needed to get kids into preschool. We started last September with 600 additional slots of preschool for 3- and 4-year-olds. Side of our loan, J.P. Pritzker, who is a philanthropist and investor, who is very subordinate loan. So he is taking the first loss position. This was not a philanthropic investment for him. He did it off of his own personal balance sheet. And I think that's important in terms of appetite for risk and interest in these transactions. Early on in the year, all of the 600 kids who went into the preschool program were tested using a standardized test that's been shown to be predictive of being at risk in school. 28% of those kids essentially failed that test. They scored 2 standard deviations below the norm, which we had agreed ahead of time would be an indicator that these were our at-risk kids. So track those children who failed the test from kindergarten through 6th grade. There is a pay-for-success contract between the county and the intermediary, the United Way of Salt Lake, that basically says for every one of those at-risk kids that doesn't use remedial or special ed services in kindergarten through 6th grade, they will make a payment United Way, and that payment will provide the cash flows to repay our loan. The way that is less than what they would have had to pay if kids went to use the remedial services. And we think that's an important part of this transaction, which basically says nobody is better off with the bad outcome than with the good outcome, because the county saves a little, the investors get repaid, And of course, obviously, the most important thing is that you have 5-year-olds in class ready to learn and on track with their peers. Doesn't hit its impacts. If kids aren't on track and on grade ready, then Goldman Sachs and J.B. Pritzker lose money, and the state and the county pay nothing. And so in this sense, it's really an effective risk transfer. And we think that's one of the real key benefits for government. The other benefit, and again, I think this echoes earlier remarks, is a focus on outcomes. Again, speaking more from a domestic U.S. context, but I think there are real corollaries and learnings here, is, and we're hearing this from our partners on the ground that are delivering the service, the focus on outcomes, because everybody has to get to the table ahead of time and agree what theirs are, has been really positive for how they manage the program. And on the downside, you know, these are untested. They're brand new. And so scale that, and the answer is we don't know yet. Another big issue is in terms of replicating these, whether or not they're in a domestic or a global context, is again something Mansour said, government capacity. It requires a new way of government thinking about how they do business. And another really big issue on this, particularly when you're talking about human capital infrastructure, is provider capacity. Right? We launched a partnership with the IFC around access to capital for women SMEs globally, where we are launching a fund in partnership with them where IFC will be originating investments in local financial institutions that will then make end loans to women entrepreneurs. In this case, because it's the Goldman Sachs Foundation, we're playing a bit of a different role. We're providing the blended finance, and so what we're doing is providing a $50 million grant that will go towards both first loss on the fund and risk-sharing facilities, interest rate incentives to encourage financial institutions to lend to more women SMEs, as well as grant dollars to fund capacity building for the financial institutions, as well as for the women SMEs on the ground. So we